HOA Karen faked violations against me, but now he's facing fraud charges. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was 9:30 in the morning when James first saw the letter. It lay on the floor just inside his front door. A single sheet of paper, its edges slightly curling as if it had been waiting for a long time to be discovered. The morning sunlight filtered in through the windows, casting a soft glow across the living room. But the paper seemed to gleam with an ominous purpose. James had no idea what to expect as he bent down to pick it up. But when he read the words printed in sharp, bold letters, he felt the room close in around him. Violation of HOA regulations. Unauthorized landscaping. His heart sank. The words were like a punch to the gut, and they stuck in his throat, making it hard to breathe. He turned the paper over, as if to check if the message would change, but it was still there, black and white and undeniably real. It didn't make any sense. How could this be happening? His yard had been manicured to perfection, every flower planted with precision, and the lawn trimmed to an almost military standard. He had put blood, sweat, and countless weekends into making his home a place he could be proud of. Petty complaints about the slightest imperfections, yard ornaments, mailbox placement, even the shade of paint on a front door. If something could be fined, Rick would find a way to do it. He took a perverse pleasure in it, and everyone knew it. But this was different. This wasn't just another silly complaint about a garden gnome or a fence. No, this felt personal. As James stood there, staring at the letter, the weight of it pressing down on him, he felt a sudden flash of movement outside. His eyes darted to the window, where he caught sight of Rick's house across the street. Through the half-open blinds, he saw Rick, casually sipping his coffee, staring out at the world with that smug, self-satisfied grin of his. It was a look that made James' stomach twist in disgust. There was no mistaking it now. Rick had orchestrated this. The letter, the fine, the violation. It was all part of some cruel game Rick had decided to play. James could feel his blood boiling as the anger surged through him. It wasn't just the violation. It was the fact that Rick was enjoying this. He was sitting there, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed in James's life, completely unaware that James was about to make him regret it. His hand tightened around the letter, the edges digging into his palm as he tried to steady his breathing. This time, it wasn't going to be like all the other times. No more small complaints and ignored fines. No more sitting idly by while Rick bullied the neighborhood. This time, James was ready. He had spent months biding his time, watching Rick, collecting the pieces he would need to take him down. He had seen the cracks in Rick's armor long before this letter showed up on his doorstep. Rick was corrupt, power-hungry, and far too comfortable with using his position to impose his will on others. But that was about to change. James could feel a rush of resolve flood through him, pushing the anger aside and replacing it with something far colder, far more calculated. It wasn't just about the yard anymore. No, it was about much more than that. It was about taking Rick down, exposing him for the fraud he truly was. Rick thought he could get away with anything, that no one would dare challenge him. But James was no ordinary resident. He had been waiting for this moment, gathering evidence of every illegal demand, every unjust fine, every shady move Rick had made. And now, with this letter, he had the perfect excuse to make his move. James took a deep breath and stepped outside, feeling the cool air of the morning against his skin. He walked slowly across the front yard, his eyes fixed on Rick's house, his mind already working through the steps he would need to take. The letter was only the beginning. It was a symbol, a catalyst, but it would be Rick's undoing. As he walked, he could feel his pulse quickening, a sharp sense of purpose taking root in his chest. He had waited long enough. Now it was time for action. The next few hours were a blur of activity. James didn't waste any time. He headed straight for his desk, pulling open drawers filled with files, notebooks, and old HOA correspondence. He had been keeping track of Rick's overreach for months, documenting every infraction, every unjust fine, every time Rick had come to his door with that smug look on his face. But today, it wasn't just about the petty stuff. Today, it was personal. He was going to gather everything, photos, emails, recordings, Anything he could find that would expose Rick for the bully he truly was. The more James sifted through the papers, the clearer it became. Rick wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a criminal. Over the past few months, James had noticed strange patterns, questionable behavior from Rick that didn't add up. He had found discrepancies in the HOA's finances, suspicious transactions, and complaints about illegal inspections. But today, as he went through the records again, something new caught his eye, a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. It was the HOA funds, money that had gone missing, funds that had been diverted, funneled through bogus accounts, and siphoned off for personal use. James stopped cold, his fingers hovering over the documents. This was bigger than he had anticipated. Rick hadn't just been a nuisance, he had been stealing from the community. It was all right there, in black and white, an open secret waiting to be exposed. And now, James had everything he needed to take Rick down, not just for the petty violations, but for the larger scheme he had been running for years. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of it all settle in. This wasn't just about Rick anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood. About all the people Rick had bullied, the residents who had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid to fight back. But not anymore. James was ready to take the fight to Rick. And he was going to make sure that when it was all over, the whole neighborhood knew the truth. As James sat there, piecing together the last bit of evidence, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Rick hadn't just made a mistake. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. This was no longer just about a lawn or a fine. It was about power, about control, and about exposing the corrupt system that had been ruling over the neighborhood for far too long. And James was going to bring it all crashing down. With a final glance at the documents before him, James knew what he had to do. He was ready. He was no longer the quiet homeowner trying to keep his head down. He was the man who was going to take Rick Hastings down. And it was going to be glorious. Rick Hastings was a man who never truly understood the line between authority and oppression. As president of the Homeowners Association, he had managed to position himself as an almost godlike figure in the neighborhood. Every decision, every tiny detail about how the residents maintained their homes was subject to his judgment. And he reveled in it. What started as a simple position to help keep the community in check had, over the years, transformed into something else entirely. The HOA wasn't just an organization anymore. It was his personal fiefdom, and he was its unchallenged king. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he patrolled the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, always looking for something to enforce, some petty regulation to impose. He was the type of person who found delight in creating problems out of nothing. A leaf out of place? Fine. A bush growing slightly over the sidewalk? Fine. A neighbor not trimming the edges of their lawn exactly as he'd decreed? You guessed it, fine. The people in his neighborhood had grown used to him. They feared him. And fear, Rick had learned, was the most powerful tool in maintaining control. Rick was known for his arbitrary decisions, but there was something especially disturbing about the way he relished his power. James had seen it firsthand during their short encounters. Rick was not simply a man who followed rules. He was a man who created rules, bent them to his whims, and used them as weapons against those who didn't obey. It wasn't about maintaining order anymore. It was about keeping people in line, about watching them squirm under the weight of his judgments. When James first moved into the neighborhood, he had hoped for peace. The charm of the small cul-de-sac, the pride in everyone's front yard, and the promise of community had drawn him in. But it hadn't taken long before he encountered the one thing that could tarnish even the prettiest of neighborhoods. Rick Hastings. At first, the fines had seemed trivial, laughable even. A crooked fence here, an extra trash bin there. But as time went on, the complaints grew more bizarre. James had been slapped with fines for leaving a garden gnome in the wrong spot, for trimming his lawn at an incorrect angle, and for a variety of offenses that seemed to change with Rick's mood. Rick's focus, however, had shifted more recently. James became the prime target. It had started with petty, nitpicky remarks, a notice about a flower bed that didn't meet the HOA's supposed standard for color coordination. But as Rick had turned his gaze more intently on James's property, the complaints had become more personal. Rick's unprovoked attacks, like the one about the flower bed, had shifted from irrelevant and ridiculous to insidious. Each fine, each unwarranted inspection, seemed to be pushing James further into a corner. There was a pattern. Rick didn't just want to make James comply, he wanted to break him. James had endured it all stoically. He had hoped the situation would blow over, that perhaps Rick's attention would move to someone else. But it hadn't. If anything, Rick seemed to take delight in the challenge James presented, as if the very defiance James held against him was an affront to his carefully constructed kingdom. James wasn't like the others in the neighborhood. He wasn't just going to pay the fines and keep his head down. That's what Rick had counted on. He thought James would bow to the pressure, accept the constant harassment, and quietly slip into the background. But James was done playing along. He had no illusions about Rick's character. Rick was a bully, plain and simple. He didn't need to make a case out of it. James knew exactly who Rick was. The more he thought about it, the more his resolve solidified. Rick didn't just rule with an iron fist. He ruled with the fear that others had of him. It wasn't enough for Rick to impose rules. He thrived on making people feel powerless. James had learned how to play the long game. He knew that to defeat someone like Rick, someone who was both arrogant and delusional about his own power, he had to outsmart him. He began to gather information quietly, methodically. Every fine, every ridiculous letter, every odd inspection, James documented it all. He saved copies of every communication, recorded every conversation, and took photographs of the absurdities he had to endure. There was nothing Rick could do now. James was building a case, not just for himself but for everyone Rick had wronged. Rick's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The last time James had seen him, Rick had been walking down the street with a broad grin on his face, surveying the neighborhood with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had been the perfect picture of power, sipping coffee as he marched down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, eyes darting from house to house, looking for his next victim. It was almost as if Rick was daring someone to challenge him, daring someone to take him down. Little did Rick know someone was already prepared to do just that. James had spent the past few weeks secretly meeting with his neighbors, gathering allies who had, until now, been too afraid to speak up. People like Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who had been fined for having too many lawn gnomes. People like Mrs. Green, who had been harassed for asking the HOA for assistance with roof repairs. James knew their stories, and he knew they all shared a common thread: fear of Rick and the consequences of standing up to him. But James wasn't afraid. He knew that Rick was more vulnerable than he appeared, that behind his smug grin and dictatorial behavior was a man who was ultimately too reckless and corrupt to remain untouchable forever. And then, on a blistering Friday afternoon, the moment James had been waiting for arrived. Rick was out patrolling, clipboard in hand, doing his usual rounds. As he neared James's house, James could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. He knew what was coming. This was it. Rick had been relentless in his petty attacks, and James had been expecting another violation notice. But this time, James wasn't going to back down. He had made sure he was ready. The time for talking was over. The doorbell rang just as James was in the backyard, pruning his hedge. He froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Rick was on the other side of that door. He stood up, brushing off his hands, wiping away the sweat that had accumulated on his brow, and walked inside to meet him. When James opened the door, Rick didn't waste any time. "You've got a violation," Rick said, pushing a piece of paper into James's hands. "Unauthorized landscaping," he added, his voice dripping with disdain. James took the paper, his fingers gripping the edges tightly. His mind raced. This wasn't just a violation. This was Rick's attempt to provoke him, to assert his dominance once again. But James didn't flinch. He stood tall, steadying himself against the weight of the moment. "What exactly is the violation?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled. "This yard has been perfect. You've inspected it before." Rick didn't even look James in the eye. He was too busy looking past him, scanning the yard, searching for anything else to criticize. As Rick stepped away, James could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was more to this than just another fine. This was personal. The moment Rick disappeared down the street, the silence settled like a heavy weight in James's chest. But something else lingered in the air. A quiet, simmering rage. James knew that Rick had just made a huge mistake, one that would come back to haunt him. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of afternoon that felt as though time had slowed down, where every blade of grass seemed to glisten in the still air. James stood at the edge of his backyard, scissors in hand, carefully pruning the hedge that bordered his property. The smell of fresh-cut greenery filled the air, grounding him in the simple satisfaction of a job well done. His hands moved with precision, shaping the hedge to match the vision he had for his home, a sanctuary of peace and order in the midst of a world that often felt chaotic. As he moved to trim a particularly stubborn branch, James caught sight of movement out of the corner of his eye. He paused, his heart momentarily skipping a beat. There, walking down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, was none other than Rick Hastings. The HOA president was doing his usual patrol, a job that seemed more like a mission of dominance than one of genuine community care. Rick's eyes scanned the houses as he moved, searching for any sign of imperfection, any minor infraction that could lead to a fine. It was the same routine he had followed for years, and James was all too familiar with it. Rick had a knack for showing up when least expected, always with the same smug smile plastered on his face. James had been waiting for this moment, knowing that it was only a matter of time before Rick found something to complain about. It had been a while since the last fine, and it was clear that Rick was eager to continue his reign of petty harassment. James rolled his eyes, not bothering to hide his annoyance. He had dealt with Rick's small-minded rules for far too long, and today, it seemed, was no different. But this time something felt off. Rick wasn't just inspecting the houses as he usually did. No, today he was walking directly up James's driveway, clipboard firmly in hand. There was a sharpness to his steps, an air of finality in the way he moved toward the front door. James's pulse quickened. This wasn't a typical fine delivery. This was something more deliberate, more personal. His hand tightened around the pruning shears, and a sense of unease settled in his chest. As Rick approached the door, James set the shears down and wiped his hands on his pants. He felt the familiar weight of frustration pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside, steeling himself for whatever was coming. He knew this confrontation was inevitable. It was the moment he had been anticipating, the moment when Rick's tyrannical control would finally hit a breaking point. Rick knocked twice, the sound sharp and deliberate, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The noise seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, each second stretching out like an eternity. James stood still for a moment, his heart thudding in his chest, before finally walking toward the door. His hand rested on the doorknob, and he paused, taking a breath to steady his nerves. He opened the door. "What's this about, Rick?" James asked, keeping his voice calm, though the irritation was clear in his tone. Rick didn't even look at him when he spoke. Instead, he thrust a piece of paper into James's hands, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've got a violation," he said curtly. "Unauthorized landscaping," he added, his words sharp and dismissive. James glanced down at the paper, his mind racing. The words swam before his eyes as he tried to make sense of what he was reading. Unauthorized landscaping? It didn't make sense. His yard had been meticulously cared for. Every flower, every plant, had been chosen with care and planted with precision. There was nothing that could possibly warrant a fine. And yet here was Rick, standing in his doorway, smugly handing him a letter that seemed more like a personal attack than an official notice. Before James could respond, Rick was already turning to leave. "I'll be back in a few days for a follow-up inspection," he said with a grin that made James's blood boil. It was as if he was relishing in the power he held over James, as if this moment was just another notch in his belt. But as Rick walked away, something strange happened. A sudden silence fell over the house, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel thick and oppressive. The hum of the air conditioning unit, which had been running in the background, suddenly stopped. James paused, his hand still gripping the doorframe. A flicker of movement from the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he turned toward the electrical panel on the side of the house. And then, it hit him. His heart dropped into his stomach. The lights in the house flickered once, then twice. The power was out. James stepped out onto the porch, looking down the street. No one else seemed to be affected. His neighbors' homes were still lit up, their lights glowing softly through the windows. It was clear now Rick had done this. It wasn't just another petty fine. It was sabotage. He had cut James's power, a personal message, an act of control designed to rattle him. The thought of it sent a surge of anger coursing through James's veins. This wasn't just about the rules anymore. This was about Rick trying to break him. James stood there for a moment, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, he took a deep breath, grounding himself in the stillness of the moment. He wasn't going to let Rick win. Not this time. Over the past few weeks, James had been preparing for a moment like this. He had known that Rick's abuses of power were only going to escalate. And so, he had begun collecting evidence, photographs, emails, recordings of their confrontations. He had carefully documented every infraction, every instance where Rick had overstepped his bounds. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And now that moment had arrived. James walked back into the house, the silence around him oppressive. The lights were still out, the darkness settling in around him. But he didn't need the lights to see the path forward. He had everything he needed. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the notes he had compiled, reviewing the evidence he had gathered. He had caught Rick on camera peering over a neighbor's back fence during an unannounced inspection. He had captured the exact time and date of every one of Rick's late-night visits. He had emails, photographs, and even a few recordings of Rick's own voice, laced with the arrogance and disdain that James had come to expect from the man. But there was something more, something James hadn't expected. As he reviewed the photos of Rick's inspections, one image stood out, a picture of Rick standing in front of a house, his clipboard in hand. But behind him, partially obscured by the trees, was a car. A car that didn't belong to the neighbor, but one that had been parked there for days, unnoticed by most. James's pulse quickened as he zoomed in on the image. The car's license plate was visible, and it didn't take long for James to recognize it. It was Rick's own vehicle. This was it. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for. James's mind raced as he pieced everything together. Rick had been more than just a petty HOA president. He had been embezzling funds, using his position to manipulate the neighborhood for his own gain. This car, parked on the street for days without any reason, was just one piece of the puzzle. There was more to uncover, more to expose. Rick had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and James was going to make sure he paid for it. The game had changed. Rick thought he was in control, but James had already outsmarted him. He had everything he needed to bring him down, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. The confrontation was coming, and it would be the last mistake Rick Hastings ever made. As James sat there, piecing together the final details of his case, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building within him. The neighborhood had suffered under Rick's rule for far too long. But that was about to change. James wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to expose Rick for the fraud he truly was, and when the time came, Rick would regret ever crossing him. The lights flickered once again. This time, James barely noticed. He had a plan, and it was only a matter of time before Rick Hastings would be facing the consequences. James sat at his kitchen table, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating the scattered papers in front of him. Each document, each photograph was a piece of the puzzle he was building. His hands were steady as he flipped through the photos of Rick's various infractions, uninvited late-night inspections, the way Rick had walked across a neighbor's yard without permission, a clear violation of privacy. Every photo, every word told a story of abuse, but it was the patterns that intrigued him most. He wasn't just dealing with a petty tyrant. Rick had been operating with a greater agenda, using his power to manipulate and steal from the community, all while hiding behind the guise of authority. James's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but his determination was unwavering. The weight of what he was doing, the lives he was about to change, kept him focused. He had long known that Rick's tyrannical behavior wasn't just about minor complaints or nitpicking over garden decorations. Rick was playing a dangerous game, one that was going to come crashing down. It wasn't just the HOA regulations that Rick was breaking. He had been embezzling money from the community's funds, lining his own pockets while the neighborhood suffered under his thumb. James knew that bringing down Rick Hastings wasn't going to be easy. The man had power, allies, and a history of intimidating anyone who dared to stand in his way. But James had something Rick didn't: the truth. And the truth he was learning was a powerful weapon. As he sifted through the documents, a sudden thought crossed his mind, something that had slipped under his radar until now. It was a small detail, one that hadn't seemed important at first, but now it was the missing link he needed. A phone call from a disgruntled neighbor, an innocent conversation that had taken place months earlier, now stood out like a beacon. The neighbor had mentioned that Rick had asked for a donation to the HOA fund, a request that seemed normal on the surface, but something about it had always felt off. James quickly pulled up the recording of that conversation. He had kept every email, every phone call, every interaction, just in case something like this happened. As he listened to the recording, he felt his heart race. Rick had promised to put the donations toward community improvements, but there had been no improvements. The money had simply disappeared. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. It was exactly what he needed to tie Rick to the embezzlement charges. But now, James had to be careful. He couldn't reveal this evidence too early. If Rick found out what he had, he would cover his tracks, destroy the evidence, and likely retaliate. No, James needed to be strategic. He had to wait for the right moment to strike. The next day, James visited his neighbors. One by one, he spoke with them, carefully building rapport, his voice calm but firm. He knew they were all nervous, afraid of what Rick might do if they spoke out against him. But James wasn't just asking them to share their stories. He was giving them a chance to take back their power, to stand up to the man who had controlled their lives for far too long. And to his surprise, many of them were ready to speak. There was Mr. Thompson, the elderly man whose beautiful garden gnomes had once earned him a fine. There was Mrs. Green, who had been told her roof repairs weren't up to code, even though she had followed every rule. They all had one thing in common: a deep sense of frustration, of helplessness, that James had felt himself. But now they had a voice, and James was giving them the courage to use it. As he gathered their testimonies, he couldn't help but notice the patterns in their stories. Every one of them had been harassed by Rick at some point. While going through his files late one night, he came across a long-forgotten document, one that had been buried beneath all the others. It was a financial report, one that Rick had filed with the HOA board months ago, claiming that the neighborhood had accumulated more funds than expected. James had seen the report before, but something about it now caught his eye. It didn't add up. The numbers were off, and the discrepancies were glaring. Rick had been hiding something big. The report was an elaborate cover-up, an attempt to mask the fact that money had been siphoned off for personal use. If James could prove this, Rick's entire empire would collapse. But there was no time to waste. James needed to act fast, before Rick had a chance to cover his tracks. He had to move carefully, gathering his final pieces of evidence and preparing to confront Rick once and for all. He wasn't just going to expose the truth, he was going to bring Rick to justice and make sure the man could never harm the neighborhood again. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with tension. James spent every waking moment putting everything together, organizing the evidence, and preparing his witnesses. He knew the meeting with the HOA board was coming up soon, and it would be his one shot to take Rick down. If he failed, if he made one wrong move, it could all fall apart. Then the day arrived. James stood in the parking lot, the sun setting behind him as he took a deep breath. He had done everything he could. The evidence was in his hands. The witnesses were ready. And now it was time to confront Rick. As he walked into the HOA meeting, the familiar tension filled the air. The board members were sitting at the long table, Rick at the head, his usual smug expression in place. But today something was different. James could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Today, Rick's confidence would be shattered. James had no illusions about what he was about to do. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it was a gamble he was ready to take. Rick barely looked up as James took his seat. He was too busy scribbling notes, preparing for the usual discussions that had become routine. But as James stood up and placed the folder on the table, the room fell silent. "Mr. Hastings," James said, his voice steady and calm, "I think it's time we take a closer look at the truth." The board members shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure of what was coming. Rick, however, still didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. He smiled, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "What's this, James?" he asked, trying to sound casual. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out the financial report. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is a lie, and I have the proof to back it up." As James began to present the evidence, the board members began to shift uncomfortably. Rick's smug expression started to falter, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to defend himself. But the more James spoke, the clearer it became that Rick had nowhere to hide. The truth was out, and Rick's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as James stood at the front of the HOA boardroom. The room, filled with neighbors and board members who had watched in silence for far too long, was now an arena for confrontation. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the hum of the fluorescent lights above sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down the final moments of Rick Hastings's reign. Rick, seated across from James, radiated confidence as always, his chest puffed out, and a smug grin on his face. He seemed unaware of the storm that was about to engulf him. James' mind was sharp, every nerve on edge. This was it, the culmination of months of research, witness testimonies, and carefully gathered evidence. His heart raced with a quiet, focused determination, not for vengeance, but for justice. As he stepped forward, his calm demeanor concealed the fire burning inside. He had always been a patient man, methodical in his approach, and now it was time to unveil the truth. He placed the folder on the table with a deliberate motion, the sound of the papers shifting inside punctuating the silence. The eyes of the room followed the movement, anticipation hanging in the air. James opened the folder, and the first piece of evidence, a video recording of Rick's illegal inspection, was projected onto the screen at the front of the room. Rick's face turned from smug to confused, his gaze narrowing as he stared at the image of himself sneaking around a neighbor's backyard, peering over a fence without permission. But Rick couldn't. The evidence was irrefutable. "Mr. Hastings," James said in a tone that was calm yet unyielding, "this is just the beginning." The words hung in the air like a warning, a foreshadowing of what was to come. Rick's hands, which had been casually resting on the table, now clenched into fists. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The confident smile he had worn so often was gone, replaced by a twitch of his jaw and the first hints of panic creeping into his eyes. James continued, unveiling more evidence with precision. Photographs of fraudulent fines, emails where Rick had used his position to manipulate HOA funds, and documents detailing the embezzlement of money from the very people he was supposed to serve. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Rick's coffin, each one a reminder of the web of deceit he had woven. But James wasn't finished yet. One by one, the witnesses stood up. Mr. Thompson, his frail hands shaking as he spoke, recalled the day Rick had fined him for a garden gnome that, in his eyes, violated some obscure HOA rule. Mr. Johnson, an elderly man with a raspy voice, talked about the fine he'd received for repainting his front door a darker shade of blue, a minor change that would hardly raise an eyebrow anywhere else. And Mrs. Green, her face lined with years of struggle, spoke of the harassment she endured after asking for help with repairs to her roof. As each person shared their story, the tide of the room shifted. Neighbors who had once feared Rick now found the courage to speak out. Their voices, once silenced by fear, grew stronger, each one a blow to Rick's crumbling empire. James watched, the satisfaction of knowing he had turned the tide settling over him like a warm cloak. This wasn't just about revenge, It was about exposing a system of corruption that had preyed on people for far too long. Rick's face grew pale, his arrogance fading with each passing second. He tried to interrupt, to speak over the witnesses, but his voice faltered. His hands, once confident on the table, now trembled as he grabbed for the papers in front of him. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate. He had known this day would come, but seeing it unfold before him still carried a weight of triumph that was impossible to ignore. Rick tried to stand, to storm out of the room, but James wasn't finished. "Before you go," James said, his voice steady and sure, "I've got one more thing to show you." He clicked a button, and suddenly, a live feed appeared on the screen. It was footage from a hidden camera James had installed in Rick's office. The footage showed Rick in a conversation with a contractor, discussing under-the-table payments to bypass building codes and approval processes for personal gain. The shock of the revelation was palpable. Rick's eyes widened, his face drained of color as the implications of his actions became clear to everyone in the room. He had no explanation. The board members, once loyal to Rick, now looked at him with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They had been complicit in his actions, but now, in the face of undeniable proof, they had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Rick tried to shout, to make some desperate attempt to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by the rising murmurs of the crowd. The truth had taken on a life of its own, and there was no silencing it now. As the board members turned their backs on him, James stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had done it. He had exposed Rick for the fraud he was, and now the consequences would be inevitable. The police arrived shortly after, ushering Rick out of the room in handcuffs. His protests fell on deaf ears as he was led away, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The neighborhood, once held hostage by his reign of fear, now stood united in the face of his downfall. In the weeks that followed, the community began to rebuild. The HOA was disbanded, and a new leadership structure was put in place, one that actually cared about the needs of the residents. James, who had once been just another quiet neighbor, was now hailed as a hero. His efforts had changed the course of the neighborhood's future. But for James, the victory wasn't about the accolades or the praise. It was about doing what was right. It was about ensuring that no one would ever have to live in fear of a corrupt HOA president again. Rick's downfall was a lesson in justice, a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of accountability. His reputation, once built on manipulation and fear, was shattered in an instant. He had underestimated James, thinking he could break him, but it was Rick who had been broken in the end. As James walked through the now peaceful streets of his neighborhood, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The battle was over, and the neighborhood was free from the grip of a tyrant. For the first time in a long time, peace had returned. But as James looked around, he knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice was never truly over, and he would always be ready for whatever came next. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, but it highlights the real dangers of corruption and abuse of power within some HOAs. It serves as a reminder that dishonesty and manipulation always come to light, and those who try to take advantage of others will eventually face the consequences. Our goal is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire accountability in leadership.